and I think like a lot of sexual abuse charges.
I saw somebody smoking in their car with a kid in the back with their windows closed like 2 days ago. Is circumcision blank?
Painful.
No.
Welcome back, Reformers. It is September 24th, and today we're going to talk about circumcision, evil in the light of God's goodness, and we're going to react to a video or two. You ready?
Ready.
All right. Now, we know circumcision is no longer a biblical mandate. That's in 1 Corinthians, that's in Galatians. So no reason biblically to circumcise your kids anymore. There's a new covenant now. There's a new sign for that covenant. But there are many arguments for and against circumcision, medical purposes, hygiene. We're going to dive into that today. I definitely don't have as strong of a conviction on this as Matthew does. So I'm going to let Matthew first explain his position, provide any data that he wants to back it up, and then I'll kind of explain where I stand in this whole debate. So you want to kick it off?
Yeah. So I had strong opinions before I prepared for this, and they're stronger now. So this will be fun. Let's start with, can you guess what some of the top searches are? What some of the top searches are regarding circumcision? Is circumcision blank?
Ethical.
That is not one of them for this search term.
Okay. Necessary.
Yes.
Okay. Is circumcision necessary? Is circumcision recommended?
No.
No. Is circumcision painful?
Yes, that's number 2. Yeah, so for this one, the top, and I went and did 9 of them because they're pretty different actually, but the top search was, is circumcision good? Which is actually really interesting to me because that's a pretty relative term. That's like people searching for what is the morality in this, which I think is interesting for what the most popular Google search is. But is circumcision good? Is circumcision painful? Is circumcision covered by insurance? Is circumcision required by Islam was number 4, which was interesting. Is circumcision in the Bible? Is circumcision mutilation? Is circumcision bad? Is circumcision painful for babies? And is circumcision necessary? So we'll play with the next one. Does circumcision blank? Guess what some of these are.
Does circumcision hurt?
Number 1.
Does circumcision affect you long term?
That was not one of the top searches.
Does circumcision cost money? No.
One more guess.
Does circumcision work?
No. So the long-term one is kind of hard because all these questions could be also said in the long term. But this one, it was the top searches for does circumcision blank were, does it hurt? So you got that one. Does it affect pleasure? So that's a pretty common question. Does it prevent HIV? That's one of the common medical reasons cited for circumcision. Does it affect size? That one was a little unexpected. It's just from common sense perspective. Does it reduce sensitivity? Does it have any benefits? Does it hurt the baby? And does it make it smaller? so dumb.
People are concerned.
All right.
Babies here.
So the summary of these questions is basically, the first summary is it good? Does it hurt? Is it painful? So kind of the overall concern for the morality and pain side. Religious questions, is it good or bad in regards to a religion? Here we have Christianity and Islam present. And the third grouping of questions in the article, yeah. Yep. And the third question would be, is it necessary and what are the medical implications if we were to kind of batch it a little bit? This next thing I'm going to share is actually kind of interesting. This was a 2020 survey done, and what they do is just ask a sample group of people. They had 34 total people, so not a huge sample size here, but this is actually trying to get perspectives and what the current perspective on circumcision is. There were 7 male and 27 female enrolled in the this is a human sexuality course at a university, and they did this study through that course. And they found some pretty interesting things, I think, but this is just kind of from 2020. What's the state of perspectives on circumcision among college-age people? Findings indicate emerging adults do not often discuss male circumcision and do not carefully consider the procedure, perhaps due to the widespread belief that circumcision is a social norm that should not be questioned. Despite this lack of discussion or formal education in the topic, most of the emerging adults did express strong opinions in favor of circumcision based on their personal experiences and social interactions. So what we have here is basically a bunch of people who are not particularly educated, have the perspective very strongly that it should be done, which is pretty interesting because that's, in my experience, that's most people's origin of their perspectives. It has a lot to do with, this is how I am, this is kind of what's normal, this is what I think is accepted. So, and all these studies will be in the show notes below. But that's a really good summary, I think, of, it's a small sample size. You could say it's not symbolic, properly symbolizing the entire population. That'd be fair. I was just thinking that was pretty similar to what my understanding of it is. Yeah. So the first group, the first question that I wanted to address is, does it change sexual pleasure positively or negatively? I do have a study I'm going to put in the show notes. I'm just going to share the conclusions for most of these if you wanted to go in and actually look at how they derived their methods and all of that, which you should if you're figuring this out for your own kid. Then you can do that through the show notes. But this one was the contrasting evidence concerning the effect of male circumcision on sexual function, sensation, and pleasure, a systematic review. This is also from 2020. I tried to find studies within the last 4 years generally. And the question they were trying to ask was, active debate concerns whether male circumcision affects sexual function, penile sensation, or sexual pleasure. I'm just going to go straight to the results here again. You can go in and look through if you want. Search identified 46 publications containing original data, 4 systematic reviews, and 29 critiques of various studies and 15 author replies, which together comprised a total of 94 publications. There was overall consistency in conclusions arriving from high and moderate quality survey data in randomized clinical trials, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, physiological studies, large longitudinal studies, and cohort studies in diverse populations. Here we go. Those studies found that male circumcision has no or minimal adverse effect on sexual function, sensation, or pleasure, with some finding improvements. A consensus from physiological and histological studies was that the glands and underside of the shaft, not the foreskin, are involved in neurological pathways mediating erogenous sensation. In contrast to the higher quality evidence, data supporting adverse effects of MC on function, sensation, or pleasure were found to be of low quality, explaining critiques of those studies. So the consensus is it has actually potentially some benefit on sexual function.
I want to know if they took, I just have a note real quick. Did they take volunteers to be like, hey, have a circumcision, tell us if it improved or if it got worse?
Yeah, so this one looked at like a ton of different studies. I think they said the total was, it was a lot.
So who the heck would volunteer for that? You have to pay a lot of money.
They looked at a ton of different studies, over 70, and so this one, it's actually looking at a ton of other studies that looked at it individually, and what they do in these meta-analyses, which I think is really helpful, is they apply criteria and say, well, this has a high bias, this is unlikely, this cannot be repeated, the results can't be found again, and so then they sort through and weed out a lot of the poor quality studies, which is why I love where science has come to now, where we have these huge databases of studies where they can evaluate so many items. So interestingly enough, and this is an argument often cited for people who disagree with circumcision, which I would be one of those people that disagree with circumcision. They often say, well, it must reduce sexual pleasure, removing something with more nerve endings than almost anywhere else in your body. And at least from the multiple studies that I read on it, it does not do that. So that's not even worth making an argument for, because we can't find any study for it.
The study I have said the same thing as yours, that there was multiple studies showing that it didn't actually do that.
Yeah. So the next question I want to jump into is the more subjective one of, is circumcision good? And this is also going to get into the medical evidence for it. Those are kind of the other two big things here. And you notice we kind of skipped over is there biblical evidence for? If you believe there's biblical evidence for circumcision now, that's a much deeper and longer conversation regarding covenant theology that we probably can't really get to in this amount of time. And so if you would like to see an episode where we discuss that, we'd be happy to, but we're both very comfortable with the fact that it's no longer necessary.
Biblically, yeah.
Biblically, correct. So let's jump into Is Circumcision Good? I'm actually going to read, this is from a lawyer who regularly publishes in the Virginia Law Review. I thought this was a very interesting summary, that this is basically written to address, is there potential risk of litigation for medical facilities, hospitals, and networks in terms of male genital cutting is the term it uses in here, MGC. So it's kind of interesting because they're actually looking at their bottom line saying, is this something we should do? And this was published in, this guy was editor of the Virginia Law Review and the Virginia Journal of International Law. He teaches international law at the University of Massachusetts. And then the other author is a pediatrician and clinical professor at Michigan State University. And there's more, and they have lots of credentials, and they are very qualified to speak on the matter as a team. So this article suggests, and this is just entitled, Is Circumcision a Fraud? And we can, again, put the references in the show notes. This article suggests that non-therapeutic male circumcision or male genital cutting, they're just going to use MGC, basically they use male genital cutting, which is obviously a slightly stronger word than circumcision, but I think they're doing it to get a point across. MGC, the irreversible removal of the foreskin from the penises of healthy boys, is not only unlawful in the United States, but also fraudulent. As a German court held in 2012 before its ruling was effectively overturned by a special statute under political pressure, circumcision for religious or non-medical reasons is harmful, violates the child's rights to bodily integrity and self-determination, which supersedes competing parental rights, and constitutes criminal assault. Male genital cutting also violates the child's rights under U.S. law, and it constitutes a battery, a tort, and a crime, and statutory child abuse. Building upon a 2016 case in the United Kingdom, we make the novel suggestion that when performed by a physician, male genital cutting is a breach of trust or fiduciary duty, and hence constructive fraud, where courts impute fraud even if intent to defraud is absent. We reprise and build upon the argument that it is unlawful and Medicaid fraud for physicians and hospitals to bill Medicaid for unnecessary genital surgery. Finally, we suggest that male genital cutting constitutes intentional fraud by the American Academy of Pediatrics, AAP, and most physicians who perform circumcisions in the United States. They have long portrayed male genital cutting as medicine when it is violence, and as a parental right when males have the right to keep their penis. They have long portrayed male genital cutting as medicine when it is violence, and as a parental right when males have the right to keep their penile foreskin, and physicians are not allowed to take orders from parents to perform unnecessary genital surgery on children. Various aspects of potential litigation would be favorable to the plaintiffs. Hence, we conclude that male genital cutting exposes physicians, hospitals, and the American Academy of Pediatrics to large and possibly uninsured liability. This is also from 2020. So this is a very interesting, if you really want a startling take, this is a group of physicians and lawyers writing to the medical complex, basically saying you're opening yourself up for huge amounts of litigation in multiple ways because you're performing unnecessary mutilation to young boys. Pretty crazy, and to see that all written out, especially by the people of their level of credentialing, this does beg the question, well, as Christians, God tells us to do this in the Old Testament. So how do we rationalize violence committed against a child through male genital cutting against the Old Testament? And so I want to go there, if you feel that we can go there for the moment, and kind of see how would you respond to someone saying, you're calling it mutilation of children, and God in the Old Testament expected it of the Israelites.
Personally, my stance on this is that each person has to hold their own conviction. So I'm not on one side or the other, really. I think that you have to have a personal conviction when it comes to it. And part of the reason I land there is because I don't think God would. Now, it was a sign of an old covenant. Now there's a new covenant, and it's no longer a sign of that new covenant. So the argument of it being a continuing thing is out of the picture in my mind. But for God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. So for God to have said for us, to have commanded for the Israelites to do this, I would say that you can't say it's immoral because of that. Now, I know that it's different now as well than it was then. And your reasoning comes into play a lot too. That's why your conscience has to guide you with that. So if you hold firm in your conscience that you do believe the Bible teaches in the New Testament that you should be circumcised. I think it's Paul took Timothy to be circumcised so he could witness to the Jews. After he had already said that you don't have to be circumcised, he took Timothy and got him circumcised. Say your reasoning is somehow that it'll help you better witness to the Jews. I don't know what your reasoning is. It could be a million different things. But that's what Paul's was for Timothy being circumcised. The procedure is different. I know that. The medical procedure now, there's a lot more apparently that is cut off in a circumcision. But my answer to that person would be that God wasn't immoral in that. I don't think parents, especially all parents today, that decide to have their kids circumcised are making an immoral decision. They could be because I think it's a conscience thing. But I don't think they always are. So to me, it really depends on your reasoning and what you've been taught. You might not know any of this. You might just know what a doctor told you.
If I could push that a little further, do you think that, well, twofold question. So God tells people in the Old Testament to kill other people.
Mm-hmm.
But does that justify modern day murder?
No, because murder and killing are two different biblical definitions as well. So we do have capital punishment that is biblical. I would say that's the same thing in the Old Testament that we see when God tells his people to carry out those killings of man, women, and children.
But you would generally say that's not something that they could just follow their conscience on. Like it's something that would have to be determined by a body or a group of people in power, right?
Yeah, but the government still has to make that decision of capital punishment. So each case by case is different. You might decide in one case to do it. You might decide in another case to not do it.
But the governing body always has to determine that. I guess what I'm getting to is, so if we use that parallel from the Old Testament, there has to be a governing body, whereas your previous statements seem kind of like you can follow your personal conviction. And so if we take that same application and say, well, if it's wrong, if it's just mutilation of a child, and we're just doing it, then it's not necessarily the same thing because there's no governing body. You're basically saying we can follow our own personal conscience on the matter. Whereas in many other things, you would say you might feel okay murdering someone. You might not have a conscience about it, but there's a governmental system of justice that says, no, you cannot. So I guess for me, I don't know that it travels all the way down the road to this is personal conviction when you're getting into the way they word it is male genital cutting.
The difference is the Bible gives you clarity with capital punishment and it doesn't with this. So in the New Testament, there's more conversation about capital punishment and the right way to go about it. There's not about circumcision. So with capital punishment, I can go to verses and I can say, this is specifically how we should look at this through a biblical lens. I think maybe a comparison we could use is like God deems homosexuality to be wrong in the Old Testament. There's no way we could ever deem it to be right. And again, there's no perfect comparison here because he clarifies homosexuality in the New Testament. But with circumcision, he deems it to be something that's good. So I don't think it's always a wise thing to do for us to deem it as evil.
Yeah, I think defining terms here is pretty important. Biblical circumcision in the Old Testament was often a small piece of flesh being removed from the tip. This is where I'll get to my personal experience. I worked as a medic in the Air Force for 6 years. I worked in the ER civilian side for several years as well. And while I was an Air Force medic, I worked in pediatrics and labor and delivery. And so labor and delivery is where they generally would do the circumcision from. And it is a very, very, very intense surgery. It's not a surgery, is it? You're not putting them to sleep because they don't do that to newborns. But the one where I experienced, they take a cap, they basically open the foreskin, they put a cap down in it, and they put one on top of it that you screw it down and it removes all of the flesh from around the tip. It's absolutely painful. So for all the Google searches, is this painful? That baby will silently scream. It's in so much pain. Like the most pain you've ever seen a baby in, you haven't seen anything close to this, unless of course your child went through a broken limb or something. It's insanely painful. And so that answers the Google search question. Is it painful? Yes. And I think that I don't think it's something that you can just leave to your personal conscience because you're inflicting pain onto other people without good necessity, in my opinion. But that's where we'll get to some of the medical documentation that's on it. So it's pretty interesting. So I was the medical lawyer calls it male genital cutting. Here we're going to get into one study evaluating the medical evidence for or against it. This is from January 2022. What is the medical evidence on non-therapeutic child circumcision? So non-therapeutic would mean that they're having issues actually urinating, if they're actually having medical complications, which is incredibly rare. This is just the majority of kids are just circumcised, just to circumcise. So the conclusion in this one landed at, we conclude that non-therapeutic circumcision performed on otherwise healthy infants or children has little or no high-quality medical evidence to support its overall benefit. Moreover, it is associated with rare but avoidable harm and even occasional deaths. From the perspective of the individual boy, there is no medical justification for performing a circumcision prior to an age that he can assess the known risk and potential benefits and choose to give or withhold informed consent himself. We feel that the evidence presented in this review is essential information for all parents and practitioners considering non-therapeutic circumcisions on otherwise healthy infants and children. So that's one. And they'll be in the show notes. This is from the International Journal of Impotence Research.
I'll add a note to that. One thing that I noticed as I was doing this study, which I did it for a couple hours or so, I'm by no means an expert on it, was the use on both sides of pretty inflammatory language, which is why I landed where I landed. So that article said that there's little to no evidence in support for circumcision, but it can cause, and they went straight to a very extreme stance, death, as to where the articles defending circumcision do the same thing. They say that there's little evidence of any complications ever happening with circumcision, but there are extreme cases when you don't get circumcised where you die of infection of someone in Africa who's really unsanitary. They go to the extreme of people. It's not your general person. So the one that I read that I liked the most said, and it cited, we'll put the link in the description as well, but it cited several studies on both sides and said, in both situations, it's very unlikely that the negative thing occurs, that each side is trying to scare you on. Now, they could either way, but it's very unlikely that either one does.
Yeah. The basis I always approach something like this from is this is an elective surgery. So the most normal thing to do here in terms of just being human is to not perform an elective surgery. So if you're approaching it from, because the moment you introduce surgery, you introduce risk of infection. The moment you introduce surgery, you introduce the issue of bleeding. And so we've introduced bleeding to an infant's life that pees and poops all over itself. So the moment you enter into this surgical approach, you really have to have enough evidence. It's kind of like you are not guilty until proven guilty. I'm wording it wrong.
You're innocent until
proven guilty. So here, you're okay until you have proof that you need to do something because you're not okay.
Like someone can always decide later if something.
Yeah, and that's a big part of this. Is I'll read the study and we'll kind of get to my conclusion there. But this is a different one. So this one is called Systematic Review of Complications Arising from Male Circumcision. This was published in November 2021, and we'll put that in the show results as well. And this one, I think I wanted to share how much it reviewed 78 different articles for this one, and they basically just compiled all of the risks of circumcision surgeries. Their conclusion was complications from neonatal male circumcisions are common, and healthcare providers need to be better informed of the potential complications of the surgery so that they can more effectively counsel their patients about potential risks, likelihood of complications, and what can be done to prevent them. While experienced providers who practice in sterile settings have better outcomes with fewer complications, encouraging parents to take into account who is performing their son's circumcision, what was their training, how clean is their practice, and how much experience they have, and reminding them that they have the option to decline the procedure entirely, allow the parents to get a more complete picture and play an essential role in the decision-making process. So the interesting parts to me, because when I did this, we were having our first son, and it was during COVID, so a couple of these studies hadn't even been published yet. And what we're seeing here is large mass-scale studies approaching 140 evaluated between the last two I read, and there's more from the ones previous to that, where they have evaluated sample sizes of 39,000 people in one of them after they've distilled it down to the reliable studies. And this one, again, tens of thousands of people. And there's some of the largest meta-analyses that have been done. And both of them are basically saying there's no significant reason to do this. So again, approaching it from innocent until proven otherwise, normal, healthy until proven otherwise. We do not have mounting evidence to suggest it's worth going through a surgical process on an infant. So the question becomes, why is everyone doing it? And we see that most people, like from that early study I read, are doing it because of the norms, the expectations, their personal experiences. And so we're propagating what one lawyer calls it male genital cutting into the future just because we feel like it. Basically, we're concerned about the potential implications of maybe they're in a locker room and they get made fun of or something like that. So it's pretty crazy. The only thing that I would say is noteworthy is the risk of HIV in Africa and decreasing that transmission rate. When we're doing this show, we're talking to Christian parents. Generally, those are the people, Christian business owners, Christians in general. And so if you're living in America and you're a Christian, unless you're expecting your child to be particularly sexually promiscuous, which is probably not a good expectation for you to carry, I would argue you have no valid reason to get your child circumcised.
You're probably, we talked about this before the show, in America, if you're going to get HIV, you're going to get it regardless. if you're going around and doing the things that you should not be doing, being sexually promiscuous, then you're likely going to get it whether you're circumcised or not.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's going to make much of a difference.
There's worse things you can get.
But this is what I mean as far as like it being more subjective, especially for people that aren't educated on it at all. But in Africa, I'd probably recommend it because it's a rampant issue there. AIDS, HIV. If it can minimize that, I'd probably recommend something like that there.
I didn't get into the HIV research, so I won't go way on there. Yeah, so that was, we're talking about 2 decades ago. I don't know how fast something like that changes. I took some epidemiology courses in college at JMU, but I don't have a strong opinion on that. Honestly, if I dug into it, I'd probably land with no, like you need cultural change, not to just cut off the tips of penises. So here I actually kind of want to make an interesting parallel that I think will offend some of our base. But we approach the transgender argument from you should not be performing surgeries on delusional children, and your children should not be making medical decisions for themselves when they're 5, 8, 12 years old. They're not capable to make decisions of that gravity. Here, the consensus culturally is it's okay to perform mutilation on a small male infant. It's not only okay, it's paid for by insurance, which is insane to me. And so if you are someone who is against this whole idea of transgender kids having their genitalia mutilated, there is a similar ideology here that I have in relation to you, because basically you're saying leave kids alone, don't perform unnecessary surgeries on them, and especially don't listen to their dumb advice when they're 8 years old. This is very similar. It's not a sex change, so it's of slightly lesser gravitas, but ultimately this is a unnecessary surgery that parents are just doing willy-nilly and hospital systems are making a ton of money off of, and it's not necessary. And in the moment, I think it's pretty damaging to an infant. Now, to argue against myself, this is something that I was actually surprised by during my research. There does not seem to be any indication of long-term psychological detriments to children who have been circumcised. There's 2 studies. I won't go and read those, but that just contrasts against my own previous opinion. So I had found studies that seemed to indicate that back when I researched this in 2021. I couldn't find those again. I wish I had saved them because I can't remember the quality or how much they evaluate in terms of sample size or anything like that. But I looked at two pretty widespread studies that said there's no evidence to think there's long-term detriments. Now, how well can we evaluate that? I think is questionable. I have personally seen the studies that show CT scans of children prior to circumcision and post-circumcision, and they're significantly different. That doesn't mean I can read a CT scan or know what the long-term effects of that are, but it's an incredibly traumatic event with no pain medication days after a child is born. So my common sense says this is going to affect a child, and maybe they just can't remember. Maybe they just forget. But I've watched it happen. And I guess my last charge to parents would be, if you're not willing to go into that room and watch your infant go through it and experience what they're going through, at least so you can say that you have the knowledge of what it is. If you're going to let your kid be mutilated by a bunch of strangers in a room a couple days after they're born, 8, 9 days, whatever it is.
Typically, they have the K vitamin now. It's typically like that day.
Yeah, and get vitamin K. Like, don't even get me started on that. Like, that's used for blood clotting, which they don't normally bleed on their own. So you don't actually need that unless you circumcise your kid. So there's all these interventions that pile on top of it. But unless you're willing to go in and experience that surgery and come out of that room and say, yeah, I think that was worth it, I don't think you have any business letting strangers chop up your kids. I think it's really crazy. This whole thing is super crazy.
In my opinion, is just to do your research, because I don't want to come at parents who had a doctor sit in front of them and say, I suggest this because it will decrease the likelihood of your kid getting AIDS and penile cancer. And then you saying, okay, doc, thanks, you're the doctor, I'm not. So there are a lot of people who that's been their experience. And I don't want to throw that in anyone's face because that could very well be your reasoning. My question would be, why, if it's totally unnecessary, are these doctors still saying that to parents? Why are they still recommending it?
Yeah, I mean, if the doctor said, hey, your toe might get toe cancer eventually, we should take that toe off, would you do it?
I think most people would.
If you just listen to doctors and whatever they say, these people go through 4 years of school on incredibly widespread topics, and they're doing their best. I'm not crunch on doctors here. I think they do their best to keep up with the crazy expectations that they have in our system. But if you think that person carries the expertise on all of these topics at one time to where they can just make these decisions without you doing due diligence, especially to the point of surgical procedures, unmedicated surgical procedures on your infant, I don't think you've engaged with the reality of being a parent yet. And I'm saying that to a ton of people out in our audience that have been parents long time. All the kids are grown. They're out. I don't think you were engaging at the level you need to be. Now, also, we have access to the internet. That has made my generation much more skeptical. That has made my generation much more, we have much more access to information than a lot of previous generations have. So no criticism there. But now, for parents up and coming, if you have not done the due diligence, and if you go through all the research, and you can find your own research, combat it all you want, but if you get through that and you find not enough reason to intellectually compel yourself, and you're just like, I'm going to do it anyway, you're literally performing mutilation on an infant for no freaking reason. And that is horrible. You are a horrible person if you're not willing to do the due diligence, if you're willing to send your kid off to the other room to have the tip of their penis cut off, and you're not willing to be there and experience it just because you think it would be weird if they don't.
And you might not be, that reasoning specifically, you might not be an intellectual, though, and you might say, I don't trust myself to even find reliable sources, and that's why I've listened to a doctor who does and has the time to study. It's kind of like when people... when your lay person debates a expert in politics and their arguments never go anywhere because the politician spends 30 hours a week studying it and you don't have the time to spend 30 hours a week studying it. I think a lot of people would say this is the reason they went to medical school. I don't have the time to dive into what they did. So that's why you could also talk to several doctors, look at medical articles and journals and things like that.
If that's the case, then just don't do it. If you don't feel capable, either become capable or just don't perform an elective surgery on your infant.
What I'm saying is, if, like with anything else that's medical, if you don't have the time to do it, but a doctor's telling you to because of the health of your kid, is my point. And you're saying, I don't trust these articles and I don't have the time to study all these articles, but the doctor's not telling me it's necessarily, he's not making clear to me or she that it's elective. They're just telling me it's better for my kid's health long term. That's a different scenario than the person who says, I just don't want my kid to look weird.
Yeah, I think even in that scenario, I believe in something called extreme responsibility. It's actually a value of our company, and with that, and this attribute of mine gets me in trouble all the time. It got me in trouble this past weekend at our family's house, at my in-laws. But I don't believe that an excuse is worth a surgery. So I don't believe that the excuse of I don't have time, so I'm just going to do what this guy says, justifies the decision to perform circumcision on your kid, a genital mutilation. So if you don't have the time to do due diligence, if you're not capable, either become capable and do it later, or don't do it. You don't need to do it. There's no reason. And if you're just like fooled by a doctor, then be less foolish.
Well, and the reason I'm giving grace is because you're not just fooled by a doctor, you're fooled by the majority of doctors. It's not like you're the conspiracy theorist here in this situation, according to the masses, which is a fallacy. You don't base everything on the masses. But the masses today, the studies that I looked at would say to do it because it's medically better for your child to do it. Mm-hmm. And so that would make you then the conspiracy theorist because of what the masses say. Again, the masses also say that Christ didn't die on the cross to save us from our sins. So we don't always base it on that, but that's where I think grace is necessary, is because of that purpose. Also, I wouldn't use the example of like if a doctor told you might have toe cancer one day to cut your toe off. I think the more common one would be a lot of women when they make sure they can't have babies anymore versus the husband getting snipped. They get their ovaries removed because it also reduces the risk of ovarian cancer later in life. So they don't have it now, but there's a risk of having it and they get them removed because of that, because a doctor's telling them to, because it will reduce that risk later in life. So that would be the comparison.
It's just weird to get a surgery. It's weird to get a surgery when you don't need one. It's weird to get preventative surgeries. But it's also weird that, people live their whole life sick and don't eat well. And people accept that as this is the norm. And they don't have the mental rigidity to say, I'm just not going to do that. Or I want something better. Or I want something better for my kids. I saw somebody smoking in their car with a kid in the back with their windows closed like 2 days ago. And it's just that is a level of
incompetence.
Just not engaging with anything outside of yourself. So, yeah, I would say I don't think there's justification for letting your kid go through an elective surgery, and you would say we should have grace for those people.
And again, with the smoking, I would say no doctor is going to tell you it's okay for you to smoke in the car with the windows.
But they would have 40 years ago, and you would have still been doing it. And if you didn't look into it, your kid was going to grow up with asthma, or they were going to grow up with secondhand smoke exposure. And same scenario, you could find the information if you really sought the truth. But most people don't want to. You could choose just not to smoke if you don't know if this is good or bad. You could choose just not to do the surgery if you don't know if it's good or bad. Everyone has a choice. I think that's the biggest thing about healthcare with me. I worked in it for a good, the better half of a decade, and people think they don't have choices or decisions in hospitals. It's like they think they're in prison or something, and they think that the people there have this esteemed knowledge of everything, and it's just not true. And you should absolutely not let doctors or hospitals or physicians do anything to you or your kids that you're not comfortable with, and they haven't given you the right information.
All right, we're 30 minutes into that one, so we're going to get on to the next one. The next topic would be the bombs that have been continuing to fly in Israel. This one is pretty personal, especially to me, a little bit to Matt as well, because he knows friends that we have there right now. We can't say anything about our friends that are there, but it's very scary. And it's very sad that this continues to happen, that this war continues on, that it's been going on for 2,000 years. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and then that's what's going to segue us into the problem of evil. So first, I'm going to read just a headline from an article that I read yesterday or 2 days ago on these bombings. Recent bombings in Israel have been part of escalating tensions with Hezbollah. Israeli airstrikes targeted Hezbollah strongholds in Lebanon, killing key commanders. In retaliation, Hezbollah launched numerous rocket attacks at northern Israel. The bombings come amidst ongoing hostilities with heightened military action on both sides. The situation remains volatile, with potential for further conflict. Additionally, the U.S. has resumed delivering 500-pound bombs to Israel, reflecting the growing international involvement in the region's conflicts. The link for that is going to be in the description of the video as well. I've got it right here, so we'll make sure that Jamie puts that in there. Like I said, super sad. You have anything that you want to comment on that specifically? We're not super politically involved, to be honest with you. We've already done an episode, if you want to go back and watch it, on the conflict here. And as far as our eschatology goes, as far as covenant theology goes, we believe that Jews are in rebellion against the Father currently. If you're not a Messianic Jew. So Jews that subscribe that Christ was not the Messiah. So in this situation, we look at it the same way you would look at Russia and Ukraine. These are just two groups of people that neither one at mass or special or reserved or are saved apart from the grace of Christ. And it needs to be handled the same way that any other would. So with a lot of prayer for peace, a lot of prayer for God to be glorified among the nations through this, that God would soften hearts and bring people to Christ through this conflict. But there's no, we're not going to throw you any volatile position out there like one side should be totally wiped off the face of the earth because the other is still God's chosen people. We believe God's chosen are those who have faith in Jesus Christ. So, but that segues us into the problem of evil. So the problem of evil goes something like, if God is perfectly good, and if he is perfectly powerful, perfectly sovereign, then why does he allow or cause evil to exist in the world? I'm going to let you start with that.
I think Paul in Romans 9 speaks pretty clearly to this. But he's talking about salvation in that moment, but he gives us an illustration that I think is relevant. Basically, they say, well, if God determines who's saved and who's not, then how could we be held accountable for our actions? Something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing, and Paul says first, who is the pot to question the potter, and for the sake of illuminating, basically, good and evil. And again, I'm paraphrasing, can't really say basically and misquote a text, but that's the sense I get from it. For that sake, who are you to question what he may do in order that the good may be illuminated amongst the evil, the darkness? And so I think that nothing has to exist outside of God. He didn't have to make anything. He didn't need us. He chose to make us out of a decision to show his love and affection to a group of people. And I think that light and goodness is illuminated by evil, and so it sounds so like creative and artsy, but I think that he is weaving a narrative in which there is a protagonist and an antagonist. He's written those stories on our hearts, and that's why storytelling was the main means which we communicated through most of history. And he allows evil to exist for the sake of illuminating the light.
Romans 9 is coupled well with Job, the book of Job, and people might question, it's been since, Job is one of the oldest manuscripts that we have. And people were asking that question in the book of Job. His friends said, you've done something wrong. That's why evil is happening to you, when that was not true at all. It's the Romans 9 answer. It's, I am the potter, you are the pot. What I'm doing is right, and it brings glory to God who deserves it ultimately. I'm going to go to a couple other verses. One of them is just before Romans 9, but I'm going to read two verses to you and then discuss my take on this. Not really my take. Obviously, history's been handed down, so things I've learned from other great people. But Genesis chapter 15:20 and Romans 8:28, I'm going to read those two together. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. And then the other verse. And we know that for those who love God, all things work out together for the good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So these verses would back up the stance that is called the greater good stance, which means that what God is doing behind the scenes is for the greater good of those who love and follow Jesus. So we don't know how that works out. Our brains are way too small to understand how an infinitely powerful and knowing God works all these things out for the good of those who love him. But we can hold faith that that is true, that what God is doing, if we knew and could even comprehend why he's doing or allowing to happen what he's allowing to happen, if we could comprehend it, we would realize, oh, that was really good. Like there was a good purpose for you to do that. So that's the first take that I have. Do you have anything you want to say about that? There's another one that I really like as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's hard for us to comprehend are the millions or billions of interactions that occur from every single event. And so we can't really comprehend that there's 8 billion people in the world and every single one of them has a heartbeat going right now. And if you listen to that, it would literally just sound like one long, steady tone, because that's how we perceive things in our small little bubbles. And so if you think about this in non-religious terms and you say, well, there was a being that created a simulated reality or a previous group of humans that have advanced so far as like the Elon Musk take, like it's so improbable that we're not living in a virtual reality or a created reality by some other being at some point, which is basically just another way of saying God. But if there is a being that could create this reality, then that being is capable of directing that reality. But there's no reason to think otherwise. I mean, you can think whatever you want because this is all fictional, but there's no reason to think they can't direct that reality and that they may do things that we may do things that the ants, or even smaller, the atoms, or even smaller, the other one that gets smaller than that, I can't remember the name, to think that they can perceive. Now they're like jacks, they're smaller than atoms. They got this one. To think that thing can perceive the workings of a human being. It doesn't have the faculties. It doesn't have the awareness that there is a human being.
String theory. It's strings and string theory.
No, it's J something. It's a cute little something like Joker,
Okay.
Jack.
Well, there.
Anyway, so it's like
We're gonna get on.
So it's like the idea that we could perceive the plans, the workings, the desires, and the reasonings of God is pretty unlikely.
And keep in mind that somehow our complementary free will to God's will. So we believe in the sovereignty of God. That's why I would say complementary. Our will is complementary to his, but ours is sinful. God makes it work. He somehow makes that work for his glory. And there is the greater good. There's the problem of the answer of the greater good. There's someone from the Master's Seminary I recently heard also.
Quarks.
Quarks.
Sorry, they're called quarks, not J. I don't know why I had J.
That also kind of changed that a little bit to the greater glory. So God does everything for his glory. And throughout history, there's this ultimate plan that's unfolding that's going to work out perfectly. And what we think in 2024, especially as Americans, is so individualistic and materialistic that we can't think on terms of that overall plan of what God's unfolding through his elect, through those who would follow him and put faith in him. The other answer that I really like is the Augustinian answer called the Privation of Good, which just means that evil isn't a substance in itself. So people will say, why would God create evil? The Privation of Good teaches us that evil isn't a substance, it's the absence of good, which is a physical thing that God is. So the absence of God, the absence of good is evil, which is kind of what you were getting to. That's called the Privation of Good. And atheists don't like this answer because what it ultimately leads to is you stating that for there to be evil, there has to be an absence of this ultimate good. And for there to be an ultimate good, there has to be an ultimate authority. And that ultimate authority has to be God. Therefore, if an atheist just believes in subjective good, they don't believe in good at all. So there is no evil. There is no good. It's all subjective to a different culture. So that's that's where you're going to get with that answer when you're discussing with an atheist.
Yeah, the atheist doesn't like that the Christian will accept answers that don't give them a final.
Yeah, they want a period.
They want a period. And so like, I know someone who claims to be an empiricist, not an atheist, because the atheist says there is no God. They claim to be an empiricist. So they choose to believe in the things they can see, test, touch, that kind of thing. And for them, this would be very, very hard because he can't see, taste, touch it or anything. But the overall fallacy there is just, you can't do that with a lot of things that you live through every day, the decisions you make every day. So there's so many inconsistencies in your worldview. The ultimate picture for that person is good is whatever the masses decide good is, and bad is whatever the masses decide bad is. So during Nazi Germany, why were so many people okay with the persecution of Jews? Because that's what the consensus was in that area, and they didn't have cell phones to see the whole world's opinions at that time. And so it became somewhat acceptable. Now there's strong arguments against that, but basically it's a tribalism. It is, these are the in-groups, these are the out-groups. It's okay to commit what we would consider bad against out-groups, but not in-groups. And so that's where they would base it off of. An atheist or empiricist might base it off of what is the general consensus of the masses. We don't like murder, we don't accept it, and so therefore it's not done. Whereas if you go to Iran and they're like, hey, there's certain reasons that we can just chop people's heads off, and they do it, then that's acceptable. But in reality, I think that God's moral law is written on everyone's heart, and there's a lot of people who, if they had the ability, would rise up and stop that. But they're terrified and they're persecuted, so they can't.
And an imperialist, that goes hand in hand with a naturalist, which just means that the most, in philosophical terms, the most real thing is what you can touch. It's what you can physically hold. It's what's real. It's what you can see. They're going to have an awful hard time explaining consciousness in the human being because we think differently than the animals do. And that's something that's not it's not objective. You can't hold the conscious thoughts we have, the emotions we have. And so they would have to claim emotions aren't real, different things like that. And so it's really hard for them to do that. This has been argued for 1,000 years. So,
well, they would arrive at some of the same conclusions that we do, where there are question marks. They just say, well, research hasn't gotten there yet. Science hasn't gotten there yet. And we just say, well, God hasn't revealed that to us yet.
So you are okay with question marks is what I would say.
Yeah, they just say there are answers. We just simply haven't gotten them yet. And we're like, there are answers, and we'll just find that out when we go home to meet our creator. It is the same thing, and it has the same fallacies. They just like to say, no, it's science, and yours is a big imaginary sky daddy.
You ready to react to some videos?
Mm-hmm.
All right, you heard about the junk with P. Diddy going on?
I have heard very little of the junk with P. Diddy, but I'm semi-familiar, I guess.
Well, apparently he has a whole lot of power, and he's already been like in trouble, but now they're not going to give him bail, so it all blew up again. But yeah, apparently he's been doing some evil things, pulling some strings in Hollywood, been in control of basically all the famous people, and I think like a lot of sexual abuse charges that are pending on him that are going to be going to court.
I used to just always think of Diddy Kong when I heard his name. I didn't realize he was anything substantial.
But one of his...
If I end up dead tomorrow, you all know why.
I think he's in jail. I don't actually know. But one of the main targets, I guess you could say, of P. Diddy was Justin Bieber. And this is trending, and I thought this was really interesting. So I have a video because Justin Bieber came out with a song that basically talks about the secrets of P. Diddy. And so we're going to watch a video from when Justin Bieber was like 13 and he was with P. Diddy, because the general consensus is if you wanted to make it big in Hollywood, you had to submit to P. Diddy. That was kind of the thing.
Diddy Kong.
Not necessarily Hollywood, but if you're an artist, like if you were a rapper,
submit to the Diddy Kong.
Yeah, you gotta submit to Diddy. So here's the first video of Justin Bieber and P. Diddy when he was like, he looks like he's about 14 here.
Yeah, so as soon as you turn 16, you know what I'm saying? I'm gonna let you rock this every time you come to LA. Yeah, this gonna be yours. So every time you come to LA, it's a little dusty, but you know, come get the front shot of this.
Man.
Minute.
Woo. Okay.
Okay.
All right, so I'm gonna be driving this next year.
Yeah, when you get 16, you come down there, you gotta, you know.
So there you go. There's the first video. It's a nice car. P. Diddy saying, I'm going to let you drive this when you're 16 years old. And they pull the tarp off. It's this awesome car that he's going to get. So now fast forward to, you have all these allegations, all these horrible things that have happened, all these secrets that are being spilled. And now you have Justin Bieber, who comes out with a new song. And this is the line that's going crazy that you'll see on TikTok or wherever about that song.
Lost myself at a Diddy party. Didn't know that's how it goes. I was in it for a new Ferrari, but it cost me way more than my soul. Wasn't worth all the fortune and fame. All that girls never walking the same. Signed a paper so he never has to ever say sorry. Lost myself at a Diddy party.
Now, I think that's insane and super sad, because if you caught it, he said all the girls never walking the same, signed the papers, so he never had to basically face the charges or whatever. He signed papers. And then you see this video of Justin Bieber when he's 13 and Diddy's like, here's this awesome car you're going to get. And Justin's saying, I basically sold my soul for this awesome car. So another super sad thing.
Yeah, I don't know what any of that means. I haven't followed this close enough. It just seems weird. I mean, I guess you could see grooming behavior in there. But that whole world is a weird whole music world.
Nothing to do with.
Yeah.
And now you see like Justin Bieber, like the person he is now seems like he's healing from a ton of trauma from when he was 13 up until he's probably our age, so like 26, 27, 28.
I wonder how much of that is just his next album though. You know, like
it's been like that.
Does he have to go through like the Britney Spears hair shaved rehab?
Well, he's doing a lot better now. It's been like, and it's been like this for a few years. He's openly a Christian too. Carl Lentz was his pastor, the one who cheated on his wife.
Yeah, that's why I said I've heard that.
He was kicked out.
He was like the celebrity pastor in New York. So like, how much did they really preach Christ crucified?
Hillsong, yeah. And Hillsong, don't even get us started. That'll be a whole different episode.
I've just always wondered like how much of the celebrity ups and downs are just a crafted story. Like they have PR agents and they're like, hey, you need something to get you back in the media mix. Like, let's have you go through a tragedy. Obviously, I don't want to invalidate what the Biebs might have gone through with Diddy columns.
The Biebs.
This is a serious
The
conversation.
Beaver.
I don't want to invalidate what he might have actually gone through. And I do hope that he knows Christ.
I know what you're doing. You piece of garbage, invalidating all the stuff he's been through. How do you?
There's some pretty loose breadcrumbs there about, I don't know, but I mean he's in jail. I'm not saying Diddy's a good guy. Diddy Kong was always a little jerk in Mario Kart. So,
all right, you ready?
Yeah.
Somebody allegedly tried to kill Donald Trump again, and you're here at the podium in the White House briefing room calling him a threat. How many more assassination attempts on Donald Trump until the president and the vice president and you pick a different word to describe Trump other than threat?
So context here.
I want to hear the response.
Liberal media and the left in general, even the campaign on the left, have been using that word a lot, using the word threat for Donald Trump. What do you typically do with a threat? You get rid of the threat if they're a threat to the country. And so his point here is that you're using inflammatory language. There's been 2 assassination attempts, and you're still in this interview using inflammatory language. Now, again, with voting, I'm going to tell you, let your conscience guide you. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I think they're both garbage. But I do think in this situation,
but let that sit first.
I do think in this situation, I think they're right. Like, you keep calling somebody a threat to our country long enough. That's what we call terrorists. And now there's been 2 assassination attempts and you're still calling them a threat to our country. Probably smart to stop using that type of language. You can still be against the guy.
I mean, smart. Depends on what your motives are, that your intelligence.
Yeah, if you want to get him killed.
Trying to get elected, then you keep calling him a threat. Like, if he's dead, he's not a problem.
I think that's kind of the point. I think he's saying,
like you saw the
trying
same
to
thing with Putin during the Russia and Ukraine. I think it's still happening. Russia-Ukraine invasion. Like, they were constantly using like, are you going to call him a war criminal? Are you going to call him a war criminal? And then I think it was Biden who wouldn't do it for a really long time. And I think maybe they did it, but it didn't actually mean anything. And I don't know. Words at that level are so crafted for the narrative that I'm just skeptical. I'm skeptical of everything. I
think that you personally, as far as these politics go, since I just called both of these people garbage, which I do 100% believe they are. If you want to know where I stand with my conviction, it's always going to be with life. So think through the biblical reasons and policies of why you vote for who you vote for. But I don't think anybody should be trying to get their competition killed. And
in response to the comment on my TikTok the other day, that was like, well, if you stand for life, you should stand for life after birth too, and adoption and all. I was like, yeah, of course I do. Like, I've donated money to all of those causes. Like, what have you done about them? Yeah.
What we typically do after the baby's born is just screw you guys. No, the people who are adopting kids are primarily Christians. I've taken classes on this to adopt kids, and they're full of Christians. It's a false narrative that people paint when they say you only care about making the woman have this baby because you want to oppress her. You don't care about what happens after. We're the ones adopting. We are the ones donating the money. We do care.
If you really want to know my opinion on abortion and legislation and stuff, I think that they should just, I think that they should just make males get fixed that have issues with rape and incest, and I think there should be a lot of punishment and legislation regarding the men who can inseminate 100 women over 150 days, depending on your output level. Whereas there's one woman who get pregnant one time and carry that baby for 9 months. Like, I think all of the legislation should be pointed at men, but that's never going to happen because you would not have a voter base if you said that. I will never get elected because of that statement right there.
Don't punish the baby for the crimes of the father. I believe in the punishment of both. Probably going to get a lot of hate for that. If you want to know my position, you can look up Abolitionists Rising. Shout out to them. But actually study it. Don't just watch a short clip. Look at what their position is and why they hold it biblically. And I think that's all for today, folks.
A little abortion tangent there at the end.
All right. We're probably going to have a lot of those. All right, Reformers, we're out. Have a good week.